Hi, I'm DIYite, and today I'm going to show you how to achieve the perfect fixing into plasterboard. This is something I know quite a lot about because running a soft furnishings company, we're always having to fix heavy objects into plasterboard, and so our reputation depends on doing this well. So, what have we got in today's toolkit? I've picked out the 4 best fixings to use in plasterboard as far as I'm concerned. You've got an anchor fixing here, and then you've got 2 Fisher products, the Fisher PD8 and the Fisher UX6, and then a rule plug wall fixing here. These drill bits here correspond with each fixing. So for the anchor fixings we're using a 10mm diameter drill bit, for the PD8 8, for the rule plug 7, and then for the UX6 we're using a 6mm drill bit. For the screws we're using single thread 4x50mm wood screws. The diameter of the screw is crucial, and I'll show you why. Tools for the job: we've got the drill to drill the hole, electric screwdriver, not essential, you can use a manual screwdriver if you haven't got an electric screwdriver, and then we've got a setting tool for the anchor fixings. Again, not crucial, but a really useful tool to have. Some of you who are used to drilling into plasterboard will be thinking, why isn't he using a helter-skelter fixing, i.e. one of these? There's a very good reason for this. These fixings are not good when you're drilling into plasterboard, which is then going to have a pressure or load exerted pulling that fixing out of the wall, and I'll show you why. So, let's get started. I've drilled 4 holes in a piece of plasterboard. Each hole corresponds with the fixing that I'm using. It's important to get the diameter right. Check out the comments section at the end of this video where I'll give you details of all the right drill bits to use. Okay, first up we're going to use the heaviest duty fixing, which is the anchor fixing. I'm inserting that into my 10mm diameter hole that I've drilled. What I'm demonstrating with this piece of plasterboard is I'm showing you what happens inside the wall. Now, for real ease of use, it'd be great if you could get hold of one of these, which is a setting tool. They're only about 5 or 6 quid, certainly under £10. You can get them from anywhere like Screwfix. And what this does is it cranks the screw and tightens the anchor. So I've loosened the screw a little bit. I'm putting the setting tool, slotting it onto the screw, as you can see here, and then I'm very gradually applying pressure onto the fixing. And you can see the anchor is opening on the inside of the plasterboard to create a really good fixing. Because of the way this opens, it's particularly good for heavy duty applications where you've got a lot of weight pulling down on the screw. Okay, next up we've got the Fisher PD8 fixing. I'm inserting this into the 8mm diameter hole that I've drilled. Pushing it in tight. Now, this is why the screw diameter is really important, because the screw thread needs to pass uninterrupted all the way through the top of the fixing, and I'll show you why in a minute. And I'm gradually tightening it up. There's an audible click, which is really useful when you're fixing because you know that it's starting to work. And then the bullet starts to force itself down into the rest of the fixing. Now, this is brilliant because what this is doing is it's basically creating a really strong wedge, which is going to make it very hard for that fixing to be pulled out through the plasterboard. Okay, next up we've got the roll plug, which I'm inserting into the 7mm hole that I drilled. There we go. So we're going to insert the screw into the roll plug. Try and screw it up as vertically as you can, as straight as you can, because what we want the screw to do in this instance is to go right through the top of the plug because again, when when you start to tighten it, what it does is it forces the plug out, like the other two, to create a really strong fixing. Okay, last but definitely not least, I'm going to insert the Fisher UX6 wall plug. Again, I'm going to use the same 4mm diameter screw. And as this screw goes through, again, you need a screw that's just long enough that it goes all the way through and out the other end of the wall fixing. Now watch happens when you tighten this screw. This is really clever because what this wall plug is doing is it's basically curling over itself as you tighten it up to again create a massive knot on the inside of the plasterboard. The trick with this is to keep screwing until it gets tight, and then what you're left with is a knotted wall fixing which has created basically a plug that can't be pulled through the plasterboard. So there you have it, you've got my 4 favourite plasterboard fixings. The anchor fixing for very heavy duty applications, the PD8 which is also a fairly heavy duty fixing, and then these 2 fixings for slightly lighter duty but still very reliable fixings. To be honest with you, the fixing I use most often is probably the Fisher UX6. I tend to keep the anchor fixing in reserve. Why is this? Well, as a general rule of thumb, when you're drilling into plasterboard, you want to start with a small hole and go larger as your various fixings fail to do what you're wanting them to do. If you start with a big hole and that doesn't work, then you're in a bit of trouble. So I always start with the UX6 because it's a 6mm diameter hole, and then if for whatever reason it doesn't achieve the desired results, I can then upgrade to one of these fixings using the anchor fixing at the end here for the most heavy duty applications. Now, a couple of other things to point out. The first one is it's very important that you understand the thickness of your plasterboard, because you see these wall fixings have worked well in this standard 12mm thick plasterboard because they umbrella out on the inside of the plasterboard. If you're not sure how thick your plasterboard is, you can get a piece of wire, bend the end over to create a little gauge, and then you can pass that piece of wire through the plasterboard and then feel for where it stops, and then when you take out the wire you can see how thick your plasterboard is. If, as is sometimes the case on very good quality building projects, they've used double tack plasterboard, which means they've got 2 layers of plasterboard, you may need to tailor your fixings accordingly. For example, the anchor fixing comes with a double layer collar. So in other words, the anchor will only open at the end of that collar, which will coincide with the second thickness in the plasterboard. There are all sorts of other fixings you can get. For example, this is the heavier weight version of the UX6 fixing I showed you earlier on. So you have to tailor your fixings for the job. Now, I said to you earlier on, I'm not a fan of helter skelter fixings. I'm now going to show you why. Okay, so I'm screwing the fixing into the plasterboard, like that. Whereas my other fixings rely on basically knotting or anchoring themselves on the underside of the plasterboard, what the helter skelter fixing does is it simply has a thread that goes through the plasterboard. Now, as we know, plasterboard is very brittle, and the only thing keeping this helter skelter fixing in is the thread that's weaved its way through the plasterboard. Now, if that fixing has been over tightened as it went through the plasterboard will already have shattered around the thread. So you only have to have a limited amount of force applied to the underside of the plasterboard for that helter skelter fixing to simply fall out. Now, I've been on so many jobs where somebody before us has used one of these fixings and it's pulled out of the ceiling. So I would say stay clear of these unless you're using them where the load is only bearing down, not out. It's important you use the right diameter screw for these wall fixings, because if I'd gone for a wider diameter screw in either the PD8 or the raw plug or the UX6, it wouldn't have worked. The screw would have been too fat, the UX6 wouldn't have knotted down, the raw plug wouldn't have opened up, and the PD8 bullet wouldn't have been forced down through the wall fixing. So it's very important to use a 4mm diameter thread and the right sort of thread to go through the fixing. So I hope you found this video useful. As usual, if you've got any comments or questions, leave them after the video. And do please subscribe to my channel for access to all my other DIY videos.